Hey everybody, welcome to Black Spring. Now, after more than 15 days of economic stall, computerized trajectory, social distancing during a global pandemic, it's tough to discern what a formidable cure looks like or which elements are the greatest threat. Now, these unprecedented times will also influence the way we think about threats to our liberties and sovereignty, and even more, how far are states and nation states willing to go, and will this happen again? Now, by now, you've heard President Trump speak in terms of war and everything ranging from the Defense Production Act, deploying or stockpiling medical equipment, PPEs, etc., etc. But most recently, at the center of the crossfire, you have the drug hydrochloroquine, which has been the center of controversy and a bit of a anecdotal doubt, receiving anecdotal doubt from the medical community. So that actually brings me to today's story, which comes from our vetted source, The New American. I'd like to thank everybody for joining me here on this segment of Black Spring. Now, this particular article, it's entitled China, Making Your Medicine. Now, this was written last September 17th, 2019, and this was written by Rebecca Terrell. Now, what I will do here for the most part is I will do some verbatim, but I will do some paraphrasing and some summarizing, and I will leave you the link in the description box so that you can read at your leisure. Now, as the trade wars between the longtime adversaries escalate, America's dangerous dependence on China for vital medicines could have lethal consequences. If China stopped exporting prescription drugs and their ingredients to the United States, pharmacy shelves across the country would empty within months. Quote, "That's how dependent we are on China," end quote, Rosemary Gipson told The New American. Quote, "It's a national security threat that few people even know about," end quote. Now, Gipson is a senior advisor at the Hastings Center and co-author of China RX, exposing the risk of America's dependence on China for medicine. A whistleblower analysis of the dire situation Western countries have brought about by allowing China to dump cheap prescriptions on them, driving domestic producers out of business. Quote, "The truth is that America's dependence on a single country for the active ingredients, raw materials, and chemical building blocks for so many essential medicines is a risk of epic proportions." That's no exaggeration. The Commonwealth's behemoth is well on its way to controlling the global generic drug market. In June, the International Business Times reported that though India still leads in generics, experts note that the country receives some 80% of its raw ingredients from China. Now, this means the key components in 90% of the prescription and over-the-counter meds Americans take are sourced from a country that our Department of Defense considers a major adversary. Now, with that said, if you guys have not been paying attention to the news, we've had a situation recently in which the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi had banned the export of the drug hydrochloroquine. Now, due to the demand and also with the president basically issuing some level of threat, India is going to allegedly lift their ban to provide some case by case availability of the drug hydrochloroquine. Now, this is a bit cross-referencing my point for this article, that these dependencies that the U.S. has between China and India, it's a huge threat Now we've mentioned these particular threats before about not only national security threats, it's also, it undermines, we're undermined in sovereignty as well as independence. We are less independent if we are codependent on these nations for their sectors of their primary sector and their secondary sectors of producing pharmaceuticals or over-the-counter drugs. Now, the other point that I wish to make is that Congress has played a role in these types of decisions many times, of course, and of course, our actual Congress has failed many times before. We can go back to 94, in which they were warned about transferring power over to like the World Trade organizations and basically transferring power from the U.S., which the U.S. Congress, into these multilateral trade agreements, because according to the Constitution, it's Congress that has the power to regulate commerce amongst foreign nations. Well, if you surrender or transfer those powers to supranational agencies, then you are surrendering power and making the nation less independent, and very much you're risking many things. Now, this particular article is quite lengthy. It gives other risk involved in our dependency on with China, and of course, which is highlighting also India as well. We have those examples that are pretty clear here to see. But also, I brought up in a previous video, of course, the USMCA was another agreement which basically is a foreign entanglement, and that particular document, the relations, the negotiations are the government is the governing of that document or those relations is going to be done by an appointed committee, not by the American people, not by the U.S. Congress. And there again, there's another risk of sovereignty and another risk of codependence and a transfer of power, taking power from the people and transferring it to these supranational committees and organization. And I will give you just a couple of examples highlight a couple of things from this particular article. But of course, the risk, I'll give you the risk as well. But first, it talks about other antibiotics, which of course stands in the crosshair of bio-warfare, safeguarding antidotes, unable to supply our own needs. Quote, the U.S. government turned to European company to buy 20 million doses of recommended treatment for anthrax exposure, doxycycline, and more, explains Gipson. The company had to buy the chemical starting material from China. Well, what if China were the anthrax attacker? So this article brings out a lot of the vulnerabilities and a lot of the risk that we face in having this dependence on China and other, of course, and other foreign nations. So, for example, the article continues, and of course you can check this out for yourself. Now, this article talks about, think you're immune? Do you want to find out the source of your meds? And it says here, you won't likely read it on labels or product literature because the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, only require drug makers to list the name and place of the manufacturer or distribution, not the country of origin. And it says the company here may take powders and pound them into pills, but the powders themselves could all come from China. Call the manufacturer and you may be told either that the source of information is proprietary or that the company has worldwide sources subject to change over time. Results of online searches are iffy, though Gipson lists sites such as DailyMed and drugs.com as good leads. So you may want to keep those in mind. DailyMeds and drugs.com as good lead. So I'll continue here, and it talks about the rocket fuel contaminants. Just 10 years ago, the United States surpassed other nations by importing, quote, the most pharmaceuticals and medicines by weight from China. 188 million pounds in 2009, end quote, according to the Pew Prescription Project. Okay, we're going to jump here and fast forward to present day, when experts estimate that 80% of the APIs worldwide come from China, and despite the scant inspections, the FDA is powerless in the oversight of their manufacturer. Okay, I'll skip down a little bit. You can dig into this a little bit more at your leisure. It talks about the high price of cheap meds and how the U.S. pharmaceutical giants realize that our domestic generic drug industry is collapsing as they purchase based exclusively on price at the expense of quality and reliability. Gipson quotes the newsletter Fierce Pharma from a 2012 article, quote, dangers aside, drug makers can't live without Chinese active ingredients. So this is, here again, this is more transparency that's coming from this article that Gipson wrote. Now, on to national security point here. Nor should we allow it when national security is at stake. Our military has strict rules about procurement of everything from weapons and ammunition to nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers. On grounds of national security, outsourcing manufacturing of these instruments of war is not an option. The same policy applies to medicines and medical supplies under the Buy American and Trade Agreement Acts, which require Department of Defense and Veterans Administrations to negotiate with approved vendors based on price, not country of origin. For medicinal products, moreover, the Department of Defense is entirely dependent on the consumer market, inundated with ingredients from China. And so we have, and go on to the next risk here. We have the weaponizing pharmaceuticals. Equally devastating is the prospect of China using meds as weapons of war. Beijing is synonymous with human rights violations, espionage, and cyber hacking. Would China scruple to withhold vital antibiotics, sell placebos in place of real medicine, or even lace drugs with lethal contaminants in wartime? Quote, I have no doubt they would consider weaponizing their dominance of the pharmaceuticals market if they felt that would give them an opportunity over us strategically, end quote. Retired Brigadier General John Adams told Fox News. Okay, so, and this is to wrap up their particular points of risk. China is on target to achieve its biopharma dominance goals, and if it does, it could obliterate us without launching a single warhead or hacking the electrical grid. American consumers and taxpayers are funding that growth for the sake of cheap, second-rate medicines, while the adversary drains our domestic industry dry. So, ladies and gentlemen, you will be privy to review this document at your leisure. And as always, I would offer my tag here, which is we have a Congress that has voted against their constitutional oath of office. And this is an example from everything from a foreign entanglement, the transfer of power, making the U.S. codependent, making us vulnerable in many ways. And as I've mentioned before, if you check out most of your congressmen or congresswomen's constitutional voting record or freedom index, you will find that many of these congressmen and women do not vote with a high constitutional voting record. They have about a 34% constitutional voting record, which is big government, foreign entanglements, minus constitutional values, and much more. So let me know what you think. Why do you think that we have so many congressmen on both sides of the aisle that are willing to vote outside of their constitutional oath? And why are they willing to surrender so much power to foreign nations? And with this crisis, this pandemic, it's made another vulnerability for the American people, and for the health of the American people, for the health of the economy, and for the health of the American sovereignty, and our ability to sustain who we are and to recover. So, as usual, I'd like to thank you for joining me on this segment of Black Spring. If you could always leave your comments or concerns in the description box. Also, if you could hit the like, subscribe, or share button, that will be very helpful in the analytics on this channel. And I'd like to thank you for joining me on this segment of Black Spring. Have a great day.